Hi, everybody. I'm Phil Venables. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Google Cloud. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you all today. I think I probably know many of you, and many of you probably know me. In the capacity today, though, I'm speaking as part of one of the members of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. So this is for those that you don't know, this is a group. It's one of I think the only government advisory council that reports directly to the president rather than through a cabinet agency or other organization. And this PCAST group produces a number of different reports and recommendations for the president across a range of subjects. I had the privilege over the past year to be part of a group. In fact, I co-led the group to produce a report to the president on the importance of the topic of cyber physical resilience. And in fact, kudos to you all as an organization. Many of the things, and we certainly had Bill and Mark and the rest of the team engaged with us through this process. Many of the concepts that we introduced as recommendations may be quite familiar because they were adapted from a number of the work that's come out of various parts of GRF and the work that's done. So hopefully you'll find some resonance here. So I'm going to walk through relatively quickly the background and the recommendations. I'm not going to go through every particular topic, just really going to cover the high points, and then hopefully you'll all read the report. I'm sure the team will send around the links to the report that's on the White House website. I think compared to many government reports, we think it's a relatively interesting read. So hopefully you'll get some value out of it. And so as a result, I won't go through every detail today and really just touch on, I think, the most important points for you all. So again, I think you as an audience probably get the need for cyber physical resilience. I think the way to look at this, and the nice thing about this these three words, cyber physical resilience, they encapsulate a lot of issues. So today, clearly the interdependence between cyber and physical, as we've integrated the physical world with our digital control systems, the integration between IT and OT in all parts of our critical infrastructure has become ever more significant. And again, as you as a group will know, the challenges that come from that is we've taken a bunch of previously physically controlled systems, local IT systems, operational technology systems that were designed to be operated in isolation and didn't really have a security model beyond that, are now interconnected, and now everything is online and interconnected, and we're seeing a lot of issues from that. And so it's important to think no longer just in the world of physical or just in the world of cyber. It's important to think about cyber physical as an integrated area of issues. The other thing as well is that, again, I know you all know this, but it's important to not just think about security. It's important to think about resilience in the sense that we can't just defend all things. We have to assume a degree of compromise or a degree of outage or some natural disaster events or other things that impact our systems. And we have to be prepared not just to recover, but to maintain resilience in the face of those events, outages, and attacks. And again, I'm not going to go through all of the examples that are on this slide. Many of you will be very familiar with them, but all of them have a similar pattern in that there were unexpected dependencies and unexpected broader societal impact as a result of the event. One thing I will call out, though, is this FAA outage that was at the beginning of 2023. And this was not a cyber event. This was a good old-fashioned regular systems outage. But what was interesting for me about this, and this is what really started a lot of our thought on producing this report, was the fact that this was one system that, when it failed, effectively ground stopped for a whole morning all of North America commercial aviation. It was a system that was used to create takeoff clearances, and the system failed. Now, when it failed and everybody recovered and dealt with it, the questions then were asked: how can we make sure that one system never fails again? And that's really the wrong question to be asking, because no matter what we do to that one system, that system is inevitably going to fail again. The right question is, why does this broader system have such a dependency on that one component? And so many of the flavors of what we cover in the report and how we think about this is, again, not necessarily to avoid thinking about the security and reliability of individual systems and components, but really to take a step back and think about how do we put in place the societal approach, the technical approaches, the organizational and cultural approaches to make sure we're thinking about end-to-end systems and how we make them resilient across society. The working group that ran this, I was fortunate to co-lead this with Eric Horvitz, who's the Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft, and then with a number of other PCAST members that are listed here. We did have some external members that worked with us for about a year on this, were Richard Danzig, former Secretary of the US Navy, Kevin Fu, who specializes in medical device and healthcare security and resilience research. Dan Gear, who many of you will no doubt know, he's currently does many things, not least the CISO at In-Q-Tel, which is the US Intelligence Agency's venture capital arm, and George Anashay, who works with Mark Montgomery and the team at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy that were involved a lot in the last Cyber Solarium Commission. So we interviewed hundreds of different groups and people over a period of about a year. And so much of the recommendations are really not just what came out of our head, but what came out of the collected synthesis of both public sector and private sector organizations, as well as many trade associations and professional associations like the GRF, along with the sector coordinating councils and the ISACs. So I'm going to step through. There was 4 main sets of recommendations. I'm just going to touch some of each one to give you the main flavor. And as I said at the beginning, it's useful to read the report. The report, we think, is actually pretty interesting compared to a lot of other reports like this. So hopefully that will be somewhat rewarding. The first recommendation that we focused on was for essentially the public and private sector to establish much more aggressive performance goals on cyber physical resilience, and in particular for sectors to define minimum viable operating capabilities and minimum viable delivery objectives for what they do. And then in doing this, establish and measure more leading indicators of performance rather than exclusively lagging indicators. Now, I'm going to go in the next couple of slides in a little bit more depth about this. So first, thinking about minimum viable delivery objectives, we think it's important that critical infrastructure organizations, both in the public and private sector and collectively, define minimum delivery goals. So the one we've expressed here, just as an example, is, let's say, no more than 50,000 people will be without, say, water or electricity for more than 1 week. Now, again, that seems like an entirely laudable and an achievable goal, but we all know that when you then look at how you can guarantee that in the face of all hazards is actually a different type of problem than what you typically plan for. And in expressing these minimum viable delivery objectives, it encourages organizations to think about how to deliver that in perhaps degraded states, how to do that in the face of attacks and outages. And really, it provides a mechanism, and again, I think a lot of you will be familiar with this in your work, how to connect senior executives and how to connect individual teams to look at those more extreme hazards, and can you actually deliver this minimum viable delivery objective in the context of those hazards. And we all know that when you do that exercise, you find lots of different stresses and lots of different cases where you actually can't do that, and maybe you should. And so we think focusing on these minimum viable delivery objectives and agreeing them and driving them and looking at them in all hazards will create an improvement, not just in the reliability of individual systems, but the capability to deliver that end-to-end service across a range of organizations that are collectively responsible for meeting that goal. The other part in moving from lagging indicators to leading indicators. So again, when you look at various things around resiliency and cybersecurity performance goals and all of the different standards and outcomes that are set, they've historically been very focused on lagging indicators like malware events, number of outages, number of breaches that have occurred. And they're, of course, still important to actually track and monitor and make sure that we have under control. But what we recognized, and again, we work through this list here, we provide a lot more detail in the report, And these are simply suggested leading indicators. But we think the notion is that we move towards more express and explicit leading indicators, that when you do these well, you almost can't help but have the right outcomes in the lagging indicators. So let me pick on one example: software reproducibility. So if an organization has its software under control, it understands the provenance of its software, and it's capable of reliably, securely, and reproducibly building and deploying that software, then if it has that, and if it can measure that as being effective, then you almost can't help but have better security outcomes, because you're able to update systems without fear of operating failure. You're able to adapt and introduce security measures into that software more reliably. And then also you get a lot of resilience, because you know that you're capable of reproducing and rebuilding your software in the event of even unexpected outages. Now, the great thing about this, and actually the great thing about all of the other leading indicators we include on this list, is that they also bring significant commercial benefits. Again, an organization that has great software reproducibility also has a great deal of agility to produce new products and new features. It has great ability to reduce the cost of maintenance of software, and it has greater reliability and less errors in the software that it produces. And we think overall, one of the great advantages of moving towards a more leading indicator approach is it improves the incentives for organizations to focus on achieving security and resilience outcomes, not just because it's the right thing to do or because of loss avoidance or because of regulation, but the very practices you put in place to achieve that also bring significant other benefits to the organization. So this is why there was a big push from moving from lagging to leading indicators. Now, in recommendation 2, we talk a lot about bolstering and coordinating research and development across the US government. I won't talk a lot about a lot of the details in here, but one thing is, when you look at all of the different, for example, advanced research project agencies like DARPA or IARPA, and there's various other ARPAs for other sectors, they're all essentially doing research in similar things around systems, security, and resiliency. And one of the things that we're working as part of the national R&D plan for cyber resilience is to bring these things together in closer alignment. But the main one I want to focus on this page is this notion of establishing a national critical infrastructure observatory. One of the things that we came across as part of the work was the realization, which I think some of us intuitively knew anyway, was that our adversaries have a better understanding and a better map of our critical infrastructure and all its dependencies than we do of ourselves. And so the notion of creating, likely through DHS's National Risk Management Center, in partnership with some federally funded research development organizations, is to build what we're calling a National Critical Infrastructure Observatory, which could essentially be a read-only digital twin of the United States critical infrastructure. So the idea is to build up a progressively more detailed and up-to-date map of how all of the different organizations, systems, and capabilities across all critical infrastructures depend on each other, so that then we can use that to look for concentration points, look for unexpected dependencies, to run simulations, and to look for issues in times of peace and at times of hazard or other types of stress, to then be able to stay ahead of the threats in more reliable ways. So we're pretty excited about the work that is already happening and is going to continue to build some of that capability. Clearly, as you would expect, it's going to iterate over a number of quarters and years to start from a small perspective to build into something that we hopefully will get to a point where we have a better view of ourselves than the adversaries have of us, which at the moment is the other way around. Now, recommendation 3 was mainly directed at the government overall, which is to continue to break down silos and strengthen government cyber physical resilience capacity. So in government, there's many agencies that are responsible for various different aspects of our national critical infrastructure security and resilience, whether it's DHS CISA, NSA, Office of the National Cyber Director, NIST, the National Security Council at the White House. There's many organizations. And then there's also all of the sector risk management agencies like the Department of Treasury, Department of Energy, and all of the others for across all of the sectors. And one of the things that we call out is the need for those agencies to have sufficient resources and expertise to be able to partner with the private sector to drive these more aggressive performance goals. And a big part of this that I highlight here that we call out is the need to establish a more consistent prioritization of critical infrastructure. There's many multiple ways that this is defined today: systemically important entities, Section 9 companies, and there's a whole, each sector has a whole different framing of this. And while I think there'll never be one unified ordered ranking of prioritization, I think having more consistency will enable us to make sure that we're focused on the right organizations who have the significant critical roles in our critical infrastructure, and making sure that we are resolving some of the paradoxes that happen today, where you've got a critical organization dependent on a non-critical organization. And if that non-critical organization has an impact, it flows up the chain and impacts everything else. Clearly, where you've got those issues, they need to be resolved. The other part of this as well is really focusing on looking for the 80-20s. So what's the 20% of the private sector organizations that affect 80% of the risk of an entire sector? These are typically large tech companies, big service providers, or maybe some smaller technology and software providers that happen to be used across an entire sector. And so looking for those 80-20s identifies concentration risk in some respect. And while we have to be worried about that, we can also look on the flip side and say these 80-20s are also a significant opportunity, because if we get that 20% that affects the 80%, if we get that more reliable, more secure, more resilient, and collectively more resilient across the dependencies, then we ultimately get better outcomes. So I think the prioritization is not just about an ordered ranking of what to focus on, it's developing a deeper understanding of what those 80-20s are. And then finally, the recommendation was also, while we talk on recommendation 3 about what we expect of government, we also talk a lot about what we should expect of ourselves in the private sector. And one of the things we call out especially is the sector coordinating councils. So each critical infrastructure sector has a sector coordinating council. Some are actually staffed in their councils by the CEOs of major organizations. Others are CISOs or chief security officers. Others are not quite made up of that level of seniority, or are run by trade associations for the main part. One of the things we recognized as part of the review that we did was that the most successful sector coordinating councils are ones that have more CEO involvement, not necessarily continuously, even just episodically. So, for example, in financial services, the Financial Services Sector Coordinating Council is mostly CSOs and CISOs, but it has regular engagement to bring the bank CEOs in to partner with government officials to drive direction for the sector. And so what we think the right outcome here is that every Sector Coordinating Council has an executive council that is made up of CEOs that can oversee the activity of the regular council that's perhaps made up of CISOs, but certainly having all of that made up of organizations that are distinct from the trade associations, so there's more direct participation from the executives of the owners and operators of critical infrastructure organizations. And then finally, making sure that we're also very, very focused on the supply chain. I mentioned before the notion of looking for those 20% of suppliers that represent 80% of the risk underpinning a sector. It's also important to think about whether we're actually accurately representing that through the third, fourth, and fifth party relationships, and really making sure that we're not just designating critical infrastructure organizations that are directly in that sector as being critical and regulated or otherwise overseen, but some of the large service and technology providers that underpin those sectors get the equivalent degree of attention because they play such a significant role in the supply chain. So just wrapping up, the thing that we can all do, so the enactment of these recommendations, there's a lot that's already come through in some government programs since we published the report. There's more things being worked on. We have a whole series of implementation summits coming up with various government agencies to drive forward the implementation of the recommendations. But some of the things that we can all do between now and how these recommendations gradually promulgate over the next quarters and years is really, again, this group knows this more than most people, is move beyond defense to resilience and collectively think about how do we sustain minimum viable services in the face of attacks and disruptions. I think we all need to keep educating our businesses and government leaders on we can't defend everything. We have to be resilient in the face of attacks that do get through. We also have to do more about connecting the tone at the top of organizations with making sure that resources in the ranks exist. So there are many organizations where at the executive, CEO, and board level, they talk a great commitment about security, and they make sure their organizations have the right resources to deliver on that commitment. Sadly, though, there are organizations where there's great tone at the top in how they verbalize the priority of security and resilience, but sometimes it's not actually followed through with the resources to get that done. And the same can be said to some parts of government. And so connecting tone at the top to resources in the ranks is going to be increasingly important. We have to all think about how do we shift from tracking lagging indicators to moving to these leading indicator-based approaches. And again, there's lots and lots of detail about how to think about that and what those could be that we have in the full report. And then keeping driving and involving more senior involvement in the sector coordinating councils, not just for the sake of having more senior involvement, but when you take the perspective of how to think about cross-sectoral resilience and deeper structural changes in our sectors to promote more resilience, that's the thing that requires an even higher level of executive involvement to drive those changes beyond the individual investments that occur in our organizations. And then finally, look for these 80/20s. And if you're part of the critical 20%, as some of our companies are, then make sure that you're living up to that responsibility to deliver and protect the sector. So with that, hopefully you're having a great conference, and hopefully we'll get to reconvene in person at some point, and we'll get to see you all. And certainly, if there's any questions that anybody has or anybody wants to help out on part of the implementation of the report, then please reach out to me. And with that, I'll sign off. Thank you, everybody.